Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Wilma A. Bainbridge, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at University of Chicago, and she's published two interesting journal articles. Memory for Artwork is Predictable in 2023, and Features Underline the Memorability of Objects in 2022. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Our subject today is the interaction between visual perception and memory. I just wanted to get started by mentioning something that I think a lot of us are familiar with from more of a traditional sense, and that is the study of rhetoric and memory and rhetoric. It's one of the canons. And so this understanding that we remember things by committing them to visual images, right, and then hanging on to those visual images goes down as a study of the memory palace in the Middle Ages, and it's still used today, I guess, in some cases. But you have done research that actually proves that that's one of the best ways to remember things, haven't you?
Yeah, definitely. You would think that we all have unique experiences in our lives. You know,
Yeah.
we've all seen different faces and places throughout
Yeah.
our lives. Like, this is the first time we're meeting, so we've probably seen mostly non-overlapping faces.
Right.
But what our work finds is that people tend to remember and forget the same things. Like, there are some things that are just really memorable, some things that are really forgettable, regardless
Yeah.
of what you and I have seen in our past.
That's interesting. I think of images in my lifetime in artwork, the Scream, the clocks by Salvador Dali. I assume everybody recognizes those things. The flag raising at Iwo Jima. Have you looked into images like that?
Yeah, and maybe this is a good opportunity for me to tell you about this first paper that you mentioned.
Yeah.
This, Memory for Artwork is Predictable study.
Yeah.
So we actually find that there's something special about the pixels of famous paintings, famous pieces. Of course, people remember them because famous artists did them. They have a lot of
Right,
meaning to
right,
them,
right.
rich emotion. But there's even just something about how it's painted that makes it stick in our memories. And because it's an intrinsically memorable painting, then it lasts in my memory, but then causes me to tell other people to look at it, and then becomes part of like the cultural memory.
Yeah.
And because it's really something about the pixels of the image, this is something even AI can tell, like AI that knows nothing about our culture, nothing about art or history, but it can tell that a famous piece is going to be more likely to be remembered by people.
So
Yeah.
when it's reduced to pixels, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of things do you find there? I mean, what makes it memorable specifically?
Yeah, so basically we were curious, could we predict what people remember when they go to an art museum? Because you said visual
Yeah.
images are so
Yeah.
important for memory.
Yeah.
And one of the main times that we try and remember images is when we go to an art museum, right? You want to remember your visit. But you don't remember everything that you see. So we
No.
were curious, what do people remember and can we predict it? So we had 20 people go to the Art Institute of Chicago and explore the American Art Wing there. And
Yeah.
then after they explored the wing, we gave them a smartphone survey testing their memory for the pieces they saw.
Yeah.
Basically, did you see this picture or did you see this other very similar picture? We also ran the same experiment online with thousands of people. And basically what we found is that we made this AI system called ResMem, and it can predict what people remembered in this in-person visit and even online. So you would think, like, I have my own experiences with art, so I might remember something that resonates with me.
Yeah.
But no, actually, people act very similarly in what they remembered, and we could predict it with AI.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this is called ResMem.
ResMem, yeah.
And you input all this data in there, and it basically can analyze things.
Yeah,
and
so
tell you if they're memorable.
we've made it available for anyone. So if you Google my name and log on to our website,
Yeah.
you can upload a picture from your phone, and it'll tell you the chance people will remember it. It'll tell you, like, this is an
Okay.
80% memorable picture, or this is a 20% memorable picture. Yeah.
Interesting. So what does this have to do with the study of psychology and cognition and all that? How do you connect into this?
Well, I mean, everyone has a memory, and so I feel like as long as psychology has existed, people have been curious about memory. Like, how does memory work? Why do we remember some things?
Yeah.
Why can't we remember everything? And this answers a piece of the puzzle, and it gives a pretty surprising piece of the puzzle. Because you'd think, like, emotion plays into memory, our past experiences play into memory. But what we find here is actually a good half of what you remember, or half of what determines your memory, is the picture you're looking at. And because we can measure that and predict it, we actually can predict a lot about people's memories too.
So, but I guess what I'm getting at is why is that?
Yeah.
I mean, if you get inside the brain, what is it
Yeah.
that makes something more memorable than something else?
Yeah, good question. So we've been doing some brain studies,
Yeah.
and we think it's something deeper than just like beauty or interest. We think it's something about how the brain processes the images, that there's some images that are just easy to process, like it's like fluent, you don't need to dedicate a lot of attention to it, and those are the things that stick in memory. Versus things that just take a lot of brain power, those are harder to remember.
So, and I think some of your research indicated that it's also, while some things are more memorable, it's also true that some things can't be put out of your mind, right?
Yeah.
So the expression, I wish I hadn't seen that,
Yeah.
is actually very revealing, right? Because sometimes there are things that we see that we can't forget, right?
Yeah, we actually did a study looking at that where we tried to make people forget memorable things. Like we paid them money. We were like, I will pay you money if you can successfully forget this image, this memorable image, or remember this forgettable image.
Yeah.
And they couldn't do it. Like these memorable items stick in your memory, and you can't control it very well. And you also don't have a lot of good insight into it. Like people often can't predict what will be memorable or forgettable. But as a researcher, I can predict that.
But you can predict it.
Yeah.
Well, so any indications that you can share with us here about what makes things more memorable?
Yeah, I mean, so the main hypothesis we have now is that it's something about this ease of processing. But it looks like there are some attributes that relate to that. So for artwork, it does seem in general maybe paintings with a more central, clear focus, like clear theme, tends to be more memorable.
Well, yeah, we tell kids this in the photography classes too. You have to have a strong image, right? So I guess we've kind of figured that out, yeah.
And then
what else?
Landscapes and sort of more like watercolory, impressionistic pieces tend to be a little bit more forgettable because there's no singular focus, so it's sort of hard to come up with like a singular item to save into memory.
Now, in your research, you talk about neuronal patterns.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, so we also do studies where we bring people into the lab and scan their brains in an MRI machine while they look at images and try to remember them. And what we find is, so as I mentioned earlier, you'd think we're all different, but actually these images cause us to do the same things.
Yeah.
And this is what we see in the brain too, that these memorable pictures tend to have a really sort of like stereotyped pattern, like the same pattern, while forgettable items have very different patterns.
Yeah.
And so one thing, you asked about the study of psychology.
Yeah.
One thing is we often have studied memory and vision in totally different fields with different labs. But our work is hoping to bring the two together by telling sort of like what is the bridge from seeing something to remembering something. Because you can't remember everything you see. And so by looking in the brain, we're looking at what happens when you see something and then what helps the brain decide what is worth saving and what's not worth saving into memory.
So if I meet someone
Yeah.
and I hear the person's name, I look at them and I listen to them and I hear their voice, I'm going to remember what they look like more than I will remember their voice or their name, right?
Possibly, yeah.
Probably or possibly?
It depends. So this isn't from our lab, but there are some other labs looking at how like faces, names, and voices all combine. We've been looking at voices, but it is possible you could have a forgettable face and a memorable name, and then that helps you remember the face. So.
I see. Okay. And then something else I think in your research is that some images are distributed more in the brain. Can you explain what you mean by that? So I assume it means they're more resonant in some way, right? But what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so we have some ways, like new analysis techniques where we can look at a map of how your brain visualizes things in a way.
Yeah.
And what we find is memorable things are at the roots of this map. Or you can almost imagine that your memory is like a network. Like let's say you're trying to remember the word cat. But it's on the tip of your tongue and you can't remember cat.
Yeah.
Maybe you might first think dog, and then you might think, what's related to dog? Puppy, no, that's not what I'm trying to remember. Duck, no.
Yeah.
Oh, cat. So you sort of navigate around a tree or a network when you're remembering something. We find that memorable things are those at the very center of the tree, like the first things you think of, while
see.
forgettable ones are on the leaves. It takes you a while to get to those forgettable items.
Yeah, so survey researchers have been aware of this for at least 20 years, I know. So they'll ask someone to think about something that they assume is going to be fairly familiar, and then try to branch out into less familiar things, like maybe asking someone to remember their first bicycle, and then and then have them remember the street and the color of the house and something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so then the thing that's more memorable is at the center of that tree, you're saying. So it has more connections to it than everything else.
Exactly. So it's easier to get to with all these different triggers. Yeah.
Now, can we control that? Can I make connections if I decide I want to remember, the look of this room here, and I want to draw it when I get back to my office? Is there something I can do while I'm studying this to help it stay with me?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question we're looking at right now, because as I mentioned, there are some things that are just so forgettable that I can't pay you to remember them.
Right.
But our memory is not just purely the image. There are things like our motivation, our emotions. Like even if, let's say I have a brother who has a very forgettable face, if he's my brother, I'm still going to recognize him and remember him, right?
Yeah.
So there are ways to override it with like practice, familiarity, emotion. We're working right now on thinking about AI tools that can help, that can subtly change an image to make it more memorable. So even if it was forgettable to begin with, maybe you learn the memorable version that helps you remember the original version.
Sort of like makeup for the world.
Yeah, exactly. Makeup for the world. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Have you looked at any of the historical images that have kind of stayed with us? Mickey Mouse, right? Was Disney just a brilliant businessman, or did he really get lucky when he drew that mouse?
Yeah, I haven't tried this with historical images, but this does relate a lot to the work we did looking at famous paintings, because we were finding that some of the most memorable pieces were like Van Gogh's Self-Portrait or the American Gothic by Grant Wood. So it would be interesting to look at other pieces from history too.
And you say you go to you've been to the Art Institute in Chicago, so the Picasso's Blue Guitar Player. The Starry Night, I think, is there, right? Yeah. Do you have anything to say particularly about those paintings? Have you looked at those at all, or done any research on them?
So we did look at Van Gogh's Self-Portrait. These other pieces, they weren't a part of that experiment, but I could potentially speculate, or actually, because we have our AI available online, anyone can upload like that picture of Mickey Mouse and then test it.
We should do that. That'll be fun.
I guess one thing, sort of on the flip side, looking at more modern images, not historical images, we're actually running an art contest right now, asking anyone in the United States to try and make the most memorable or forgettable piece possible. And we're going to run an art exhibit of the most memorable exhibit and the most forgettable exhibit.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in seeing how that turns out. Now, another thing that you talk about is that people aren't very good at guessing what they'll remember and what they won't remember. Why is that?
Yeah, it's surprising. It's because what makes something memorable is not intuitive. When I describe memorability to people, they think, oh, well, a memorability is just like a beauty or attractiveness. But actually, things are memorable for different reasons, and we often don't have insight into those reasons. So indeed, we've found that people are not that good at guessing what's memorable, and even if we try and teach them, they aren't that good at learning it either. But like AI and experimenters can determine what's memorable. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And this is something that people have been talking about and studying for centuries, literally, right? Given the background in rhetoric.
And it is interesting because I feel like people use the word memorable all the time in lingo, like that was a memorable movie.
Yeah.
But when we say it, we don't, like we all have an intuition of what's memorable or what's memorability, but now we're finding that the scientific answer is actually quite different from our intuitions.
Yeah, so I've had experiences where I thought something was memorable and then it disappeared, and something that I didn't think was memorable has stayed with me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not a very tangible thing that you're looking for here, is it?
Exactly, and even with the artwork study, we found beauty and familiarity with a piece and emotion were not at all related to memorability. So you could have the most beautiful, emotionally striking piece, and you could forget it as soon as you walk out.
Really? See, I find that hard to believe. I think I would remember that.
Yeah, see, your intuitions don't matter.
I know. Well, so how did you test that?
Because we were able to measure how emotional or how beautiful people felt the paintings were, separate people, and then we also tested people's memory when they actually visited the Art Institute. So we could see that there was no correlation between beauty and memory.
Well, let's not tell Keats that because he made a big deal out of it. Okay, and what about this idea of encoding and truncating details as we age and stuff? So we see something, we encode it, in your terminology, right? And then as years go by, we're remembering it, but we're editing it. Is that right?
Yeah, because each time you remember something, you're sort of re-encoding your memory too, and so you're updating that memory trace over time.
So am I remembering what I'm remembering, or am I remembering it?
Yeah, you're
Does that
actually
make
doing a
sense?
mix. Yeah, you're doing a mix of the two. Yeah.
I see.
And it's possible that if you remember it enough times, you might be mostly just remembering the act of remembering it rather than the original item.
And that would account for people remembering things wrong as often as they do, right?
Yeah, and we're actually doing work into false memories too, or research into false memories right now.
Yeah.
You mentioned historical famous pieces.
Yeah.
There are some characters in our culture that we all have a false memory for. So maybe
really?
I can quiz you on the spot. Can
Yeah.
you describe for me what the Monopoly Man looks like, the main character of the board game?
He's got a round face, a big handlebar mustache, and he's bald.
And then what is he wearing?
A tuxedo.
Tuxedo. Does he have any accessories or anything? Or maybe I can.
Does he have a cane in one of the pictures?
So yeah,
maybe?
do you think, does he have a cane?
He might. I'm guessing.
Does he have a monocle?
Yes.
And then does he have a tie?
I don't know.
Okay, so most people, if we show them different pictures of the Monopoly Man, they will pick the one that has the monocle and the tie and the cane. But
Yeah.
he does not have a monocle. Actually, he has no eyewear.
He's not wearing a monocle?
No eyewear at all. But many people have this false memory that he has a monocle.
Yeah.
And this is true for many characters. Like C-3PO has a silver left leg.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so we've been looking at, there are these false memories that everyone shares too.
Yeah. But you know, I think with the Monopoly Man, I think that's a sort of a generic drawing.
Yeah.
And I think it might be easy to blur that with other versions of that we've seen, right?
Right, you might
that one's
think
tricky.
he's the canonical like rich man, so maybe a rich older man tends to have a monocle. But we found these other examples in pop culture that don't have a clear explanation.
Yeah. So let's look at AI for a minute here.
Yeah.
How is what you're learning here going to be used by AI, and should we be worried about that?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say sort of the last decade of AI,
Yeah.
since I think it's changed in the last few years, but before then, it was really about using AI to identify basic things from images, like what are the objects in the image, what type of image is this? But now we're moving into a new version of AI where it can make more complex judgments like a human. And so one example is our neural network ResMem, where you can upload an image and it tells you the chances someone remembers it, right? And
so just stop there for a
Yeah.
second, but I'm going to pick this back up. But so, in other words, if I'm running an advertising agency, and I've had a photographer take a picture of this cup in a studio, maybe a couple dozen pictures, right? Instead of showing these to a focus group,
exactly.
I could just
you
run
show
this
it
through
to
your program, right?
ResMem. Yeah,
Interesting.
and so this is actually something I feel like there might be a big shift in the next few years. And this
Yeah.
is happening not just in my lab for memory, but other labs looking at like quantifying humor or consumer decisions. So indeed, we've made ResMem so that no one can profit off of it,
Yeah.
that companies cannot use it for profit, because I've been sort of aware of this possibility that you could use it to make the most memorable advertisement possible.
Well, that wouldn't be wrong, would it?
Yeah, that's where it gets a little ambiguous. I mean, advertisers have always wanted to make memorable ads, and jingles, right,
Yeah.
are designed to be memorable. But I guess it is a little, apocalyptic to think of scrolling through social media and everything competing for your memory. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, that raises, and I want to go back to your general answer here, but that raises another interesting question. So if I'm looking at 10 pictures, and this hasn't been adjusted in any way, right, or refined, I'm going to see some that I remember more than others, right? I might remember 2 of them or 3, right? But if all of these have been run through your program and they're all like tens on the 1 to 10 scale of
Yeah.
memorability, right? Am I more likely to remember all of them, or is my brain still going to pick out the 2 outstanding ones and,
Yeah,
and throw the rest out?
we're curious with, we're thinking of testing this with our all memorable art museum
Yeah.
or art exhibit.
Yeah.
Basically, we're going to have anyone who visits our exhibit, anyone who visits, we're going to test their memories afterwards
Yeah.
and see were they able to remember everything. And some initial research is showing that you can hold more memorable things in memory. So, of course, we all have limits. We can't remember hundreds of phone numbers at once. If it's memorable phone numbers, you'll still remember more of them than if it's forgettable phone numbers. So it does help boost your capacity
Yeah.
a little bit.
Okay, so back to AI.
Yeah.
What else? What else should we worry about here?
Yeah, so beyond just being able to measure the memorability of a piece, you might be able to manipulate how memorable it is. So I could take a photo of myself and make it more memorable, and then make that be my LinkedIn profile picture so that potential employers all remember me.
So this AI program would make it more memorable for you.
Yeah.
Okay. By
By subtly changing features that it knows make something memorable without changing the perception of who I am.
So the proportions of your face would stay the same, your eyes, your nose, your mouth, but it's going to enhance color, contrast.
So we have some early work that did this before the newest version of deep learning neural networks, but it will do something different for each person. So maybe for me, it might give me a darker lip color or make my eyes a little bit more open.
Right.
But for someone else, it might make them smile more. But it still looks like a photograph of that person.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anything else with AI going on?
Yeah, so I've talked a lot about images. We're starting to do some work in our lab with auditory information too, like voices.
Sure.
We find that there's some voices that are really memorable or forgettable too. And you can imagine that's helpful for thinking about podcasts and radio.
Yeah.
And we're working on creating an AI tool that can measure how memorable is your voice. So you could imagine casting for a TV show, picking the most memorable actor with the most memorable face and voice.
I ran a phone survey with some students years back, and we were all in the phone bank. And the average student in there got 2 people to complete a survey every hour. And one of the students was getting almost everybody to complete her survey. The rest of us were just watching her in awe, and she had the same script the rest of us had. So something about her voice, right?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
the sound of her voice.
Yeah.
What kinds of things would you look for there?
Yeah, we're finding it is these really acoustic features that are really subtle that make a voice memorable. It's not something super straightforward like dialect or pitch.
So you'd be able to maybe analyze Willie Nelson versus somebody else and maybe tell us what qualities he had that made that voice more appealing to people, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I think we all think that what appeals to us is very unique to our own personalities. And I'm sure that's true to some extent, right?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up appeal. So one thing is that makes me a little bit less worried about the AI future in terms of at least this memorability work is that memorable doesn't necessarily mean preferred. So you could remember something that's terrible, something you find boring or unattractive. So making an advertisement, you might not want it to just be memorable. You want it to be positive, to leave a good impression.
Yeah.
So
a different AI program for that, probably.
Exactly. Yeah. So memorable is not always the end goal. You might want something slightly different.
Yeah. That's almost like drinking Kool-Aid that's too sweet or something.
Exactly.
Right? At some point, you're going to get overloaded.
Yeah.
So what insights do you have for people doing research on memory loss, Alzheimer's, things like that?
Yeah, so I said that we all tend to remember the same things, but this actually breaks down for people who are starting to develop early stages of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
Even before they have any clinical conditions, if they're starting to detect memory loss, we notice that then there are some images that start to become forgettable to them, even though they're memorable to everyone else. And so we're doing some work right now taking that special set of images and using them as diagnostic tools. Because if they can tell apart who has early dementia or not, then we can use them to diagnose people before they even know they're going to develop dementia.
Is there an application for this research for someone who's already experiencing this and helping them remember things even in spite of their problem?
Yeah, that is possible. We haven't tried doing this yet, but you could imagine trying to make their environment more memorable so they can hold on to things for longer, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
like when you say more memorable,
Yeah, like change out the bedspread so it's a memorable pattern, or
Yeah.
maybe at least make things that are really important really memorable. Like your medication box or something can be like particularly have a memorable
Yeah.
pattern.
So how did you gravitate into this? It's an interesting field to study.
Yeah.
I think we'd all like to be experts in this.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think I came into research at a really fortunate time where the internet was really exploding, and I actually started off doing robotics research, and I really loved like programming and the internet and designing websites and
Yeah.
AI. But at the time, robotics was sort of unsatisfying. It was a lot of like, how can I get a robot to go up a single step? And it would often fall down and hurt itself. So at the time, but I was really interested in cognitive questions, like how does the mind work?
Yeah.
And so I landed in this great lab at MIT for my Ph.D. With Odoliva, where she was using like state-of-the-art AI techniques to look at memory. And
Yeah.
that was just like a really inspirational time for me, and that's how I got started on
You
this
just kept
work.
following up on it.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Bainbridge for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.